August 23, 1944. The Allied forces are closing in on Paris. Inside the city, resistance fighters have risen up against the German occupation. And in a fortified command post, a German general named Dietrich von Choltitz sits at his desk, staring at a telegram that has just arrived from Adolf Hitler's headquarters. The message is clear and unambiguous. It contains 3 words that will haunt von Choltitz for the rest of his life: Paris must burn. Hitler's order is specific and detailed. Von Choltitz is to destroy every bridge across the Seine. He is to demolish the Eiffel Tower. He is to set fire to the Louvre, Notre-Dame Cathedral, and every other landmark that makes Paris the city of light. He is to blow up the city's water and electrical systems. He is to turn Paris into a burning wasteland that will take centuries to rebuild. Von Choltitz has the means to do it. He has stationed demolition teams at every major landmark. Tons of explosives are already in place under the bridges. The charges are set. The detonators are ready. All he has to do is give the order. But as he sits in his office, looking out at the city he has been ordered to destroy, something inside him rebels. This moment, this decision, will determine whether Paris survives or becomes the greatest cultural catastrophe in modern history. This is the story of the Nazi general who said no to Hitler, and in doing so, saved one of the world's most beautiful cities and 250,000 lives. To understand why von Choltitz made the choice he did, we need to understand who he was. Dietrich von Choltitz was not a Nazi ideologue. He was a Prussian military officer from an old military family, a professional soldier who believed in honor, duty, and following orders. He was born in 1894 into a family with 3 centuries of military tradition. His ancestors had served Prussian kings and German Kaisers. Von Choltitz himself had fought in World War I as a young lieutenant and had been decorated for bravery. When Hitler came to power, von Choltitz was already a career officer. Like many professional soldiers, he viewed the Nazis with some distaste but saw them as legitimate political leadership. He believed in serving Germany, not necessarily Nazi ideology. Throughout World War II, von Choltitz had proven himself an extremely capable and ruthless commander. He had fought in Poland, in the Netherlands where he led the devastating bombing of Rotterdam, in the Soviet Union where he commanded troops during the brutal siege of Sevastopol, and in Normandy after D-Day. He was known for his efficiency, his tactical skill, and his willingness to follow orders no matter how harsh. In fact, it was precisely because of his reputation for ruthlessness and obedience that Hitler chose him for the Paris assignment. On August 7, 1944, von Choltitz was summoned to Hitler's headquarters at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. He was ushered into the Führer's presence, and what he saw shocked him. Hitler was not the confident leader von Choltitz remembered from earlier in the war. The man before him was physically deteriorating, his left hand trembling uncontrollably, his eyes wild and unfocused. Hitler ranted about betrayal, about cowards in the military, about his determination to make Germany's enemies pay for every inch of territory. Then Hitler gave von Choltitz his assignment. He was to become the military governor of Paris with one primary mission: to defend the city to the last man, and if defense became impossible, to destroy everything of value before the Allies could capture it. Paris must not fall into enemy hands, Hitler said, except as a field of ruins. Von Choltitz saluted and accepted the assignment. He was a soldier. He followed orders. That's what soldiers did. But on the train ride to Paris, something began to trouble him. He thought about Rotterdam, which he had helped destroy in 1940. He thought about Sevastopol, which had been reduced to rubble. He thought about his family, his wife and 3 daughters back in Germany. What world would they inherit if Germany's policy was to destroy everything beautiful in Europe? When von Choltitz arrived in Paris on August 9, 1944, he established his headquarters at the Hotel Meurice on the Rue de Rivoli, directly across from the Tuileries Garden. From his office window, he could see the beauty of the city he was ordered to destroy. Paris in August 1944 was still relatively intact despite 4 years of German occupation. The grand boulevards, the Gothic cathedrals, the museums filled with priceless art, the bridges spanning the Seine, everything that made Paris one of humanity's greatest achievements was still standing. And von Choltitz had orders to reduce it all to ashes. He began preparing for the demolition as ordered. His engineers placed explosives under every bridge across the Seine, 24 bridges in total. Demolition charges were positioned at the Eiffel Tower, placed so that the massive iron structure would collapse into the river. Teams were assigned to the Louvre, Notre-Dame, the Opera Garnier, and dozens of other landmarks. The explosives were military-grade and plentiful. Von Choltitz had more than enough firepower to level the entire city center. He also had orders to crush any resistance ruthlessly. When French resistance fighters began their uprising on August 19, von Choltitz initially responded with force. His troops fired on demonstrators. They executed captured resistance fighters. They prepared for a brutal street-by-street suppression of the rebellion. Everything was proceeding according to Hitler's orders. But something was changing inside von Choltitz. As the Allied forces approached Paris in mid-August 1944, von Choltitz found himself caught between multiple pressures, each one pushing him toward a decision that would define his legacy. From Berlin, the pressure was relentless. Hitler's headquarters sent telegram after telegram demanding updates on the demolition preparations. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Hitler's chief of staff, called personally to ensure von Choltitz understood the importance of destroying Paris. "The Führer wants to know, is Paris burning?" became the repeated question from Berlin. Hitler was obsessed with the idea. He had grandiose visions of Paris reduced to rubble, of German demolition so thorough that it would take France generations to recover. It was to be Germany's final revenge on France for the humiliation of World War I and for daring to resist Nazi occupation. Von Choltitz received specific orders to blow the bridges first, then destroy the waterworks, then set fire to designated neighborhoods starting with the government district. The timeline was clear: destruction should begin the moment Allied forces entered the city's outer suburbs. But there were other pressures too. Raoul Nordling, the Swedish consul general in Paris, began visiting von Choltitz regularly. Nordling was neutral, respected by both sides, and deeply worried about civilian casualties. He argued that destroying Paris would serve no military purpose. The city was indefensible. The German army was in retreat across France. Demolishing Paris wouldn't stop the Allied advance, it would only murder hundreds of thousands of civilians and destroy irreplaceable cultural treasures. General, Nordling said during one visit, history will judge you not as a soldier following orders, but as the man who destroyed or saved Paris. Which do you want to be? Von Choltitz also faced pressure from within his own ranks. Some of his officers were fanatical Nazis who eagerly awaited the order to begin demolitions. They saw the destruction of Paris as a fitting punishment for French resistance. But other officers quietly expressed doubt. Was this really what German honor meant? Was this the legacy they wanted to leave? One of von Choltitz's subordinates, a colonel, visited him privately and said, "General, my family has served in the German military for 200 years. I do not want to be remembered as the generation that destroyed one of Europe's greatest cities." Von Choltitz dismissed him, but the words stuck. Then there were the civilians. Von Choltitz could see them from his hotel window, Parisians going about their lives under occupation, trying to find food, caring for their children, hoping to survive until liberation came. If he followed Hitler's orders, most of them would die. The bridges would be destroyed while people were crossing them. The demolitions would trigger fires that would spread through densely packed neighborhoods. The waterworks' destruction would leave the city unable to fight fires or provide drinking water. Estimates suggested that 200,000 to 300,000 civilians would die if the demolition orders were fully executed. Von Choltitz was not a sentimental man, but he was a father. He thought about his 3 daughters back in Germany. He thought about French children who would burn to death because he followed orders. And he began to wonder, what was the point? Germany was clearly losing the war. The Allied invasion of Normandy had succeeded. Soviet forces were advancing from the east. The Reich was collapsing. What would destroying Paris accomplish except adding to the catastrophe? On August 22, von Choltitz received another telegram from Hitler's headquarters. This one was even more specific and more urgent. Paris must not fall into enemy hand except as a field of ruins, it repeated. All bridges must be blown. All utilities must be destroyed. Burn the city before withdrawal. The telegram demanded immediate confirmation that preparations were complete and that von Choltitz would execute the orders without hesitation. Von Choltitz sat at his desk, the telegram in his hand, and for the first time in his military career, he seriously considered disobeying a direct order from his supreme commander. The consequences of disobedience were clear. Hitler had been executing generals who failed him or who showed insufficient commitment to total war. Von Choltitz's family back in Germany could face retaliation. He himself would likely be court-martialed and shot if he survived the war. Everything in his training, his culture, his family tradition told him that a soldier obeys orders. But everything in his conscience told him that some orders should not be obeyed. On August 23, 1944, a series of meetings took place that would determine Paris's fate. The first was with Raoul Nordling, the Swedish consul. Nordling arrived at the Hotel Muris early in the morning with a proposal. He suggested that von Choltitz agree to a temporary ceasefire with the French resistance forces. This would stop the street fighting that was escalating in the city and give time for a peaceful transition when the Allies arrived. Von Choltitz's staff officers were shocked at the suggestion. Negotiate with resistance fighters? It was unthinkable. It was treason. But von Choltitz listened. Nordling painted a picture of what would happen if the demolitions went forward. Tens of thousands would die in the initial explosions. Fires would spread through the city's densely packed buildings. With the water system destroyed, the fires couldn't be fought. With the bridges destroyed, people couldn't escape. The death toll could reach 250,000 people. And for what purpose, General? Nordling asked. Will destroying Paris help Germany win the war? Will it save a single German soldier? Or will it simply be murder on a massive scale and the destruction of treasures that belong to all humanity? Von Choltitz said nothing, but he didn't dismiss Nordling either. After the Swedish consul left, von Choltitz sat alone in his office for a long time. The second crucial meeting was with a German officer named Count Dankwart von Arnim, who arrived from Berlin with personal instructions from Hitler. Von Arnim carried written orders that left no ambiguity: Paris was to be destroyed completely, and von Choltitz's loyalty to the Führer would be judged by how thoroughly he executed these orders. Von Arnim also brought a warning. Hitler suspected that some generals might waver in their commitment to total war. Anyone who failed to follow orders would face consequences not just for themselves but for their families. It was a barely veiled threat. After von Arnim left, von Choltitz called in his senior engineer officer and asked a hypothetical question: if we were to demolish everything as ordered, how long would it take? The engineer calculated: to blow all the bridges, demolish the major landmarks, and destroy the utilities. If we start at dawn, we could complete most of it within 24 hours. The fires would continue for days afterward. Von Choltitz nodded slowly. 24 hours to destroy what had taken centuries to build. The third meeting was the most dangerous. Late on August 23, a French resistance representative managed to slip through to von Choltitz's headquarters under a flag of truce. His name was Alexandre Parody, and he was representing General Charles de Gaulle and the French resistance. Parody's message was simple: the resistance was willing to stop fighting if von Choltitz would agree not to destroy the city and to surrender peacefully when the Allies arrived. Speaking with the resistance was extraordinarily dangerous for von Choltitz. If Berlin learned he was negotiating with terrorists, he would be immediately relieved and probably executed. But he agreed to hear Parody out. The Frenchman made an emotional appeal. Paris belonged to the world, not to Hitler. It was humanity's heritage. Yes, France and Germany were enemies, but they were also both European nations with shared cultural roots. The treasures of Paris, Notre-Dame, the Louvre, the works of art and architecture, these belong to human civilization, not to any single nation or any political ideology. You have the power to save or destroy one of humanity's greatest achievements, Parody said. No matter what happens in this war, your choice in the next few days will be remembered for centuries. After Parody left, von Choltitz faced his moment of decision. All the pressures converged. Berlin demanded destruction. His military training demanded obedience. His family's safety depended on following orders. But his conscience demanded that he say no. That evening, von Choltitz did something that still puzzles historians. He drafted a telegram to Berlin confirming that all demolition preparations were complete and ready to execute, but then he delayed sending it. He also quietly ordered his engineers to begin removing some of the explosives from the most important bridges, claiming they needed to be repositioned for maximum effect. It was a delaying tactic, a way of avoiding the final commitment while not openly refusing orders. Von Choltitz was buying time, hoping that events would somehow resolve the situation before he had to make the final choice. August 24, 1944. The Allied forces were now in the outer suburbs of Paris. The French 2nd Armored Division, under General Philippe Leclerc, was racing toward the city center. They would arrive within hours. In Berlin, Hitler was in a rage. His headquarters had been calling all morning. Is Paris burning? They demanded to know. Had the bridges been blown? Has the demolition begun? Von Choltitz stalled. He reported technical difficulties with some of the charges. He claimed resistance fighters were making it dangerous for demolition teams to access some targets. He said he was waiting for the optimal moment when the demolitions would have maximum impact. It was all lies, and Berlin was growing suspicious. Field Marshal Model, von Choltitz's superior, sent a sharply worded message: the Führer expects immediate execution of demolition orders. Any delay will be considered sabotage and treason. At the same time, von Choltitz was receiving updated intelligence about the Allied advance. They were coming faster than expected. The German forces defending the outskirts of Paris were collapsing. There was no realistic possibility of holding the city. Von Choltitz called his staff together for a final meeting. He told them that Paris was militarily indefensible. Continuing to fight would only result in German casualties with no strategic benefit. Several fanatical Nazi officers objected. They wanted to fight in the streets and burn the city rather than surrender it intact. One officer shouted, "We should follow the Führer's orders exactly. Let Paris burn. Let it be a monument to what happens to those who resist the Reich." Von Choltitz looked at this officer for a long moment, then said quietly, "No. I will not destroy this city." The room fell silent. Everyone understood what this meant. Von Choltitz was openly refusing a direct order from Hitler. It was mutiny. It was treason. It could mean death for all of them. But von Choltitz continued, "We have lost this war. That is clear to anyone with eyes to see. Destroying Paris will not change the outcome. It will only add to the catastrophe and ensure that history judges us as barbarians. I will not do it. I will surrender the city intact." Some officers were relieved. Others were horrified. One Nazi officer stormed out, presumably to report von Choltitz to Berlin. But it was too late for Berlin to do anything. The Allied forces were entering the city. On the afternoon of August 25, French tanks rolled down the Champs-Élysées. Parisians poured into the streets in celebration. The tricolor flag was raised over public buildings. And in his office at the Hotel Meurice, Dietrich von Choltitz sat waiting to surrender. At 2:30 p.m., French officers arrived at the hotel. There was brief fighting as German guards resisted, but von Choltitz ordered them to stand down. He formally surrendered to General Leclerc and was taken into custody. The bridges stood intact. The Eiffel Tower pointed skyward, undamaged. Notre-Dame's bells rang out in celebration. The Louvre's treasures were safe. Paris had survived. When news reached Hitler's headquarters that Paris had fallen intact and that von Choltitz had surrendered without destroying anything, the Führer flew into one of his legendary rages. He screamed that von Choltitz was a traitor, that he should be hunted down and shot, that his family should be punished. But there was nothing Hitler could do. Von Choltitz was in Allied custody, and Paris stood triumphant and beautiful in the late summer sun. The general who had followed orders ruthlessly throughout the war had finally said no, and in doing so, had saved 250,000 lives and preserved one of humanity's greatest cultural treasures. Von Choltitz spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner of war, first in Britain and then in the United States. He was well treated, as officers generally were. In 1945, when the full horrors of the Nazi regime became public knowledge, the Holocaust, the death camps, the systematic murder of millions, von Choltitz claimed he had begun to understand the true nature of the regime he had served. After the war, von Choltitz returned to Germany and wrote a memoir titled Is Paris Burning?, which was later adapted into a film. In the book, he portrayed himself as a man of conscience who had courageously defied Hitler to save Paris. The memoir was popular, and for decades, von Choltitz was celebrated as the savior of Paris. But the truth is more complicated. Historians have spent years examining von Choltitz's record, and what they found is troubling. Before Paris, von Choltitz had followed orders ruthlessly. In Rotterdam in 1940, he had participated in the bombing that killed 900 civilians and destroyed much of the city center. In the Soviet Union, he had commanded forces during operations that involved mass killings of civilians and prisoners. He had been a willing participant in a brutal war of aggression. So why did he save Paris? Was it conscience? Was it calculation? Was it simply that he realized Germany had lost and saw no point in adding to the catastrophe? We'll probably never know for certain. What we do know is that in that crucial moment in August 1944, when he had the power to destroy Paris and orders to do so, he chose not to. Whatever his motivations, that choice saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Some historians argue that von Choltitz is overrated as a hero. They point out that he only developed a conscience very late, only when Germany was clearly losing. They note that he had followed orders for years when those orders involved atrocities against others. Saving Paris, they argue, was less about morality and more about self-preservation. Von Choltitz realized that being the man who destroyed Paris would make him a war criminal with no hope of mercy, while surrendering the city intact might earn him lenient treatment. Other historians are more generous. They argue that moral awakening, whenever it comes, should be recognized. Von Choltitz faced a genuinely difficult choice: obey orders and kill hundreds of thousands, or disobey and risk his own life and his family's safety. He chose mercy over obedience. That counts for something. The French have always had a complicated relationship with von Choltitz's memory. On one hand, he saved their city. On the other hand, he was a Nazi general who had committed atrocities elsewhere. When von Choltitz died in 1966, French officials attended his funeral, but there were also protests. The most balanced assessment might be this: von Choltitz was not a hero, but he did a heroic thing. He was a product of Prussian military culture, a professional soldier who followed orders throughout his career, often with brutal consequences. But when faced with an order that would have resulted in one of history's greatest cultural catastrophes, he found the courage to say no. That single decision doesn't erase his earlier actions, but it did save Paris, and for that, history remembers him. The story of Paris in August 1944 teaches us several important lessons that remain relevant today. First, it shows that individuals in positions of power always have choices, even when they claim they're just following orders. Von Choltitz could have destroyed Paris. He had the means, he had the orders, and he had the military tradition that demanded obedience. But he chose differently. The just following orders defense, which many Nazi officials used at the Nuremberg trials, rings hollow when we see that some officers, like von Choltitz, proved that disobedience was possible. Second, the Paris story demonstrates the importance of cultural heritage and why certain things transcend politics and war. Notre-Dame, the Louvre, the bridges of the Seine, these treasures don't belong only to France. They belong to human civilization. Von Choltitz understood this, at least in that moment, and it helped him make the right choice. In our own time, we've seen cultural treasures destroyed by war: the Buddhas of Bamiyan in Afghanistan, ancient sites in Iraq and Syria. The Paris story reminds us that we should all be guardians of humanity's heritage. Third, the story shows the devastating consequences of totalitarian ideology. Hitler ordered Paris destroyed not for any military purpose, but out of spite and grandiose delusion. He was willing to murder hundreds of thousands and destroy irreplaceable treasures simply to satisfy his own ego and ideology. Totalitarian systems, whether fascist, communist, or religious extremist, always end up destroying beauty, freedom, and lives in service to abstract ideologies. Finally, the Paris story reminds us that it's never too late to do the right thing. Von Choltitz had participated in terrible things earlier in the war. But when it mattered most, he made a different choice. None of us are defined solely by our worst moments or our best moments. We're defined by the pattern of choices we make throughout our lives. Von Choltitz's choice to save Paris doesn't erase his earlier crimes, but it does show that even those who have done wrong can sometimes do right. Today, Paris stands as one of the world's most visited cities. Millions of tourists walk across the Seine bridges, climb the Eiffel Tower, visit the Louvre, and admire Notre-Dame. Almost none of them know how close they came to not existing, how one man's decision saved it all. The next time you see a photo of Paris, the Eiffel Tower at sunset, the Seine with its bridges, Notre Dame's Gothic splendor, remember that you're looking at things that almost didn't survive World War II. You're looking at the result of one man's decision to say no to evil orders. Dietrich von Choltitz was not a perfect hero. But in the summer of 1944, when it mattered most, he saved a city, saved 250,000 lives, and preserved treasures that belong to all humanity. And that is a story worth remembering.